For decades, Russia's Baltic Fleet operated under one foundational assumption. The assumption was simple and absolute, that the waters stretching from St. Petersburg to Kaliningrad belonged, in practical military terms, to Moscow. That assumption is now dead. What NATO has engineered across the Baltic Sea over the past 2 years represents not a gradual shift in regional posture, but a complete and irreversible strategic inversion that has effectively blinded, bottled, neutralized Russia's most exposed naval force without firing a single shot. The Russian Baltic Fleet, once a credible instrument of power projection, has been reduced to a fleet that cannot leave its own harbors without transiting under continuous Allied surveillance, cannot break into open ocean without threading through NATO-controlled choke points, cannot conduct amphibious operations without facing certain annihilation. This is not an exaggeration. This is the mathematical reality of what Finland's 2023 accession and Sweden's 2024 entry into NATO produced in one of the most consequential strategic transformations of the 21st century. To understand the magnitude of this collapse, you must first understand the geography. The Baltic Sea is not the open ocean. It is a relatively enclosed, shallow body of water averaging just 54 meters in depth, connected to the wider Atlantic only through the narrow Danish Straits in the west. For Russia, this has always represented a geographical prison of sorts, but one that Moscow had learned to manage through sheer military mass and deterrence. Russia's Baltic coastline was already fragmented into 2 isolated zones: the St. Petersburg region anchoring the eastern Gulf of Finland, the exclave of Kaliningrad, a piece of Russian territory wedged between Poland and Lithuania, separated from the Russian mainland by 3 NATO member states. Even before Finland and Sweden joined the alliance, this geography was awkward. After their accession, it became catastrophic. The Baltic Sea is now effectively a NATO lake. Every coastal nation bordering it, with the sole exception of Russia, sits inside the alliance. Every choke point, every strait, every major deepwater transit corridor is now under the observation of a unified military command structure that shares intelligence in real time. How completely this transforms Russia's operational calculus is the most remarkable dimension of the entire picture. A Russian surface combatant attempting to transit from Kaliningrad into the North Sea would need to pass through the Danish Straits, a bottleneck so narrow and so thoroughly monitored by Danish, Swedish, Allied naval assets that any such movement would be detected, tracked, if necessary, interdicted before the vessel reached open water. Russian submarines face a similar problem in a sea so shallow that acoustic detection rates increase dramatically compared to deep ocean environments. The Baltic Fleet's conventional surface warships cannot contest NATO maritime superiority in this environment. Military analysts with access to NATO operational planning data have been unambiguous on this point. Any amphibious landing operation near the Estonian coastline, the Gulf of Riga, or the western Baltic Islands would be suicidal under current conditions. The sea that once gave Russia a credible coastal strike capability has been transformed into a fortified front line aimed directly back at Moscow's naval assets. But Russia's response to this encirclement reveals something even more strategically significant. Because Moscow has acknowledged, implicitly and through its own military investments, that traditional naval power projection in the Baltic is no longer viable. The Russian General Staff's answer has been a massive expansion of Kaliningrad's anti-access and area denial architecture. Iskander ballistic missile batteries, Bastion P anti-ship systems, S-400 surface-to-air missile complexes, Krasuka-4 electronic warfare platforms have all been concentrated in the exclave to compensate for the fleet's inability to operate freely at sea. This represents a fundamental doctrinal concession. When a naval power begins converting its maritime strategy into a land-based denial operation, it is not adapting from a position of strength. It is fortifying a position of acknowledged weakness. Kaliningrad has become less an offensive staging ground and more an extremely expensive, extremely heavily armed defensive enclave, surrounded on all land approaches by NATO territory and accessible by sea only through corridors under continuous Allied observation. The shadow fleet dimension of Russia's Baltic strategy adds another layer of calculated recklessness to this picture. Unable to project conventional power, Moscow turned to hybrid warfare conducted through commercial vessels operating outside standard legal frameworks. The pattern of undersea cable sabotage documented across the Baltic since 2024 bears all the hallmarks of a systematic campaign. The Eagle S incident on Christmas Day stands as the most brazen example. A vessel suspected of dragging its anchor across more than 100 kilometers of seafloor to sever critical power and telecommunications infrastructure connecting Baltic states to continental Europe. This is not the behavior of a nation confident in its conventional deterrent. This is the behavior of a military establishment that has calculated it cannot win in the open and has therefore retreated into the gray zone, into operations designed to be deniable, to exploit legal ambiguity, to impose costs below the threshold of a formal military response. What makes NATO's counter-strategy so devastatingly effective is that it addresses this hybrid threat while simultaneously tightening the conventional encirclement. The Baltic Sentry mission, launched in January 2025, represents the most comprehensive maritime surveillance operation the Alliance has conducted in this theater. Maritime patrol vessels, fixed-wing reconnaissance aircraft, naval drone systems were integrated into a persistent monitoring architecture covering the entire Baltic Basin. The EU's Parallel Action Plan on Cable Security, introduced in February of the same year, added a regulatory and legal dimension designed to close the jurisdictional gaps that Russia's shadow fleet operators had been exploiting. These two initiatives, military and regulatory, operating simultaneously, represent a layered response that mirrors Ukraine's own layered drone strategy in its underlying logic. You don't defeat an asymmetric adversary with a single countermeasure. You build overlapping systems that force the adversary to solve multiple problems at once. The UK-led Joint Expeditionary Force has added yet another layer of operational complexity for Russian planners to absorb. This 10-nation high-readiness formation, NATO-aligned but distinct in its command structure, conducted exercises specifically designed to counter the kind of seabed infrastructure sabotage that Russia's shadow fleet has been conducting. 8 Baltic NATO allies issued a formal statement declaring their right to take direct action against Russian vessels threatening submarine infrastructure. This statement represents a significant escalation in alliance messaging. The carefully chosen phrasing, "the right to take action," signals a willingness to move from surveillance and interdiction towards something more kinetic if Russian shadow fleet operations continue their current trajectory. Moscow received that message in the clearest possible terms. The air dimension of this crisis compounds Russia's problems in ways that are difficult to overstate. NATO intercept operations over the Baltic have intensified dramatically since 2024, with alliance fighters scrambling repeatedly to shadow Russian long-range bombers and their escort packages. A single intercept event in April involved 2 2M3 supersonic bombers, accompanied by roughly 10 fighter aircraft, including Su-30 and Su-35 variants. The Allied response drew French Rafales from a Lithuanian base, joined by aircraft from Sweden, Finland, Poland, Denmark, Romania, a multi-nation intercept that demonstrated the depth of integration NATO's Baltic air policing mission has achieved. Lithuania's defense ministry documented 4 separate intercept events in a single week, each triggered by Russian aircraft turning off their transponders and flying without flight plans. This behavior is not reckless. It is deliberate probing, designed to map alliance response times and identify gaps. But the response times NATO demonstrated were not encouraging for Moscow's planners. The cost arithmetic of Russia's current Baltic posture is worth examining with the same precision that applies to the drone economics playing out over Ukrainian skies. Maintaining the Kaliningrad A2AD complex, the shadow fleet operations, the electronic warfare systems. The air component of Baltic deterrence consumes enormous resources from a military budget already under severe strain from the land war in Ukraine. Each shadow fleet vessel requires armed guards, legal cover, diplomatic management, and the constant risk of seizure. Each Kaliningrad missile battery requires continuous maintenance, personnel, logistical resupply through corridors that NATO now monitors with unprecedented density. The Russian Baltic Fleet's surface combatants, unable to conduct meaningful offensive operations, still require maintenance, crews and port infrastructure. Russia is paying full price to maintain a force that cannot execute its primary mission. The broader strategic picture crystallizing around the Baltic reveals a Russian military establishment attempting to manage too many simultaneous crises with insufficient resources. Finland's 1,340-kilometer land border with Russia, now a NATO frontier, forces Moscow to maintain defensive positions across a vast northern flank that was previously a strategic buffer. Sweden's accession adds maritime and air assets of genuine capability to the alliance's Baltic posture. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, separated from the NATO main body by the Suwalki corridor, are now defended by a hardened forward presence rather than a distant rapid reaction force. Every one of these developments consumes Russian planning bandwidth and defense resources that would otherwise be concentrated on Ukraine. What the Kremlin confronts in the Baltic is the strategic manifestation of a principle that NATO has applied with remarkable consistency since 2022, that Russia can be denied options through patient, layered, legally coherent pressure without triggering the escalatory dynamics that a direct military confrontation would produce. The Baltic Fleet has not been destroyed. It has been made irrelevant through encirclement, surveillance saturation, the systematic closure of every operational corridor that once gave it strategic value. A fleet that cannot break out, cannot conduct amphibious operations, cannot transit observed choke points without Allied aircraft overhead, cannot even rely on shadow fleet proxies without those vessels being seized or monitored in real time, is a fleet that exists on paper but not in operational reality. The Bastion P missiles in Kaliningrad can still strike surface targets. The Iskanders can still reach deep into NATO territory. These capabilities are real and they are not trivial. But they are the weapons of a power that has conceded the sea itself. Russia built a Baltic strategy around naval power projection and found that strategy rendered obsolete in the span of 2 accession decisions and 1 coordinated NATO operational response. The Baltic Fleet's commanders now operate with the full knowledge that every movement they make is being tracked, that every corridor they might use is monitored, that the alliance arrayed around them has both the legal mandate and the military means to respond to any escalation they might attempt.